This lecture is on Chapter 5, Intelligence. Intelligence is the global capacity to think rationally, to act purposefully, to overcome obstacles, and to adapt to a changing environment. Now, there's a lot of ways that it can be defined, and this can also include mental abilities. But when we talk about these mental abilities, it is a little bit different than cognition. Now, cognition is that general term that stands for a series of processes by which the individual acquires and applies knowledge. So, cognition usually includes the processes such as recognition, categorization, thinking, and memory, which then transfer over to intelligence. Now, a study was done where students in an undergraduate psychology class were asked if they had the ability to change their intellectual skills right now. Would they prefer to increase them, decrease them, or keep them the same? 90% of the students chose to increase their intelligence skills, their intellectual skills. Now, across the globe, people tend to see these high intellectual skills as an asset. And so, contemporary data has then linked intelligence to positive behavioral and health outcomes. So, what's been found is that people with higher intelligence scores are more likely to be healthy than those with lower scores. And there's also a link now between how our bodies manage disease and our intelligence. So, what is general intelligence? Well, basically, it is the notion that is largely based on psychometric evidence, particularly the consistent finding of positive correlations among results obtained with tests of different cognitive abilities. So some researchers, especially during the earlier stages of intelligence testing, suggested that there was an existence of a general factor or central cognitive function that determined a certain level of performance on a variety of cognitive tasks. Now, the existence of this central cognitive function was evidenced by a set of positive correlations that were found on verbal, spatial, numerical performances. Now, what this led to was different types of intelligence to be defined. So the first is intelligence A. This is the genetic equipment as well as the potentiality or the processes of the individual. So this is basically the intelligence you're born with. Then there is the intelligence B. This is the result of the development through interaction with one's cultural environment. So the competence of a person. These are the things we learn in day-to-day life, both outside of school and in school. But then researchers went further, and they actually introduced the notion of intelligence C. And this refers to the actual performance of an individual on an intelligence test. So this became the function of how to actually measure intelligence. So it brought us to that psychometric approach to intelligence, which is the view based on an assumption that our intelligence can actually receive a numerical value. Now, this approach is one of the most controversial ones, and this is because of the ongoing debate about how accurately these values can actually be measured, assigned, and interpreted. So, approximately 95% of the population have scores on IQ tests within 2 standard deviations of 15. That means that the IQs of most people, so 95 out of 100, is going to be somewhere between 70 and 130. Now, this doesn't seem like a very big range. However, 70 is considered mildly cognitive deficient, and 130 is basically considered genius. So we're talking about from kind of the lower end of the spectrum all the way to the higher end of the spectrum in terms of a full spectrum of intelligence. So the major problem here is not just how it's measured, but also it doesn't provide for the direct assessment of cognitive skills that are shaped by a particular cultural environment. So not every cultural environment goes to school and learns things you can write out on an intelligence test. Instead, they may learn other cognitive skills that we may not learn. And these intelligence tests, they do not accommodate those activities that people perform in their day-to-day lives. Now, without this, the tests that are then created in one culture will continue to be biased against other cultural groups, and the performance would not represent the individual's cognitive potential. So it's very important for those who attempt to interpret differences, especially cultural differences on intelligence scores, that they understand the distinction between the cognitive potential, the cognitive skills, and then the scores on a particular test. So let's just say that IQ scores are the way we have to measure. So let's first look at ethnic differences. So today, there are various tests that show differences in intelligence scores among large cultural groups. So in chapter 4, the book talked about the cognitive differences between Western and East Asian subjects. So now we're going to look at those same subjects, but in terms of IQ scores. So for example, in the United States, Asian Americans, those of East Asian origin, scored the highest, then followed by European Americans, then by Hispanics, and then lastly African Americans. And on the average, African American school children scored 10 to 15% lower on a standardized intelligence test than white school children do. Now, let's really think about this. Is this because of ethnicity? Or is this because of possibly lack of access to certain things? So let's really think about this. A lot of times, African American school children go to public school. They are kind of tied to what is given to them by the government in terms of books. I don't know why I can't think of, but basically all of those school supplies come from the government. Whereas it seems that European Americans, Asian Americans have a tendency to be able to go to private schools where parents can provide for them. And it's unfortunate because it does lead to an ethnic difference. But it's not an ethnic difference in terms of the IQ scores. It's an ethnic difference in terms of what is available to them to then increase their IQ score. So most of the questions that cross-cultural psychology attempts to address are concerned with that set of measurable similarities and measurable differences that we're able to actually see. Now, we talked about ethnic differences. What about gender differences? So, gender differences. Since we have started intelligence testing more than a century ago, women as a group have usually been about 5 points behind men. Now, this gap has been narrowing in recent years, and that tendency for that narrowing effect does appear to be global. So research data from countries in Western Europe, the United States, Canada, New Zealand, Argentina, and Estonia all show that the gap in scores between men and women has become minimal. And in Argentina and Estonia, the women's scores are now actually higher. So what contributes to these changes? Well, there's two views that exist. The first one is that women have been genetically predisposed to have more advanced intellectual skills compared to men. The other is that women actually increase their IQ scores by engaging in a greater multitasking compared to men. So when we talk about intelligence and intelligent behavior, now that we've kind of looked at the differences, we've looked at ethnicity, we've looked at gender, are they the same or are they different? So let's take a look at biology. Do biological factors contribute to intelligence? Well, we have the nativist view. This is the view that all of our cognitive phenomena are inborn and that they unravel as a result of biological programming, and that environmental perception requires very little active construction by the organism. Now, hypothetically, according to the nativist view, a boy in Nepal and a girl in Venezuela are both going to be expected to develop some elements of conceptual thinking by approximately the age of 7, regardless of their culture, background, or environment. So, an assumption here is that an individual's ability to be successful on cognitive tests is going to be more biologically programmed than dependent on an educational effort. And this came from a study that found young people who take preparation courses for college admission tests showed only a very small improvement in their scores. So critics of this view believe now that there's actually little effectiveness to the preparation courses and that it actually doesn't have anything to do with biology. Other critics to this view believe that those college preparation courses are just absolutely garbage and it's almost impossible to show an improvement. So we talked about biology. What about our environment? Does our environment play a part in our intelligence? Well, if you compare yourself with any other person in a classroom, you're going to find someone that is of maybe the same height or the same weight or the same gender or the same nationality or has the same income or even the same lifestyle. But we don't all live in identical environments. So that means that our diversity is determined by natural factors such as individual, professional, educational, social, and cultural circumstances. So this leads us to human intellectual skills can be influenced by external environmental factors. Now, these factors include the overall ability of and access to resources, the variety of our perpetual experiences, the predominant type of our family climate, our educational opportunities, our access to books and travel, the presence or absence of cultural magical beliefs, general attitudes, cultural practices. So basically, these and other conditions have been found to influence our performance on intelligence tests. Now, certain types of environmental influences determine the individual's experience with these influences. So an example that was done in your book was that studies show that our acquisition of mental functions depend on our interaction with the environment, and that cognitive skills may play a crucial role in our survival, and so they may develop earlier than other skills. Brazilian and Colombian street children who earn money by selling fruits and vegetables on the streets, and often at age 10 or younger, they are able to conduct financial calculations in their minds without making mistakes. However, when we gave these children pencil and paper, they could not make the same calculations with pencil and paper. This is because the children do not receive formal schooling. So as a result, they haven't learned the whole algorithm of adding and subtracting on paper. But if you ask them to do it in their mind, they could perform all of those complex mathematical equations. So our environmental factors do affect higher mental operations, such as our planning abilities or the stability of environment. So in a stable environment, most of these changes are going to be predictable. And that's because people are certain about their lives. They feel they're in control of their future. So those environmental influences are going to determine our experiences. Can socioeconomic factors play a part? Well, yeah. So intelligence scores are in general positively correlated with the socioeconomic status of the individual. And it's very much like I talked about when we were talking about race and IQ. Those that have access to books, journals, all of those types of things that we need to learn are going to have a higher intelligence score than those that don't have access. Now, the link between socioeconomic conditions and test performance may possibly be revealed at very early ages. So it was found that a child's IQ and the socioeconomic status of the parent were very positively correlated, meaning the higher the child's IQ, the higher her or his parents' socioeconomic rank. So children who grew up in a privileged environment, they tended to show those higher scores than their peers that came from a more deprived environment. It's also been found that socioeconomic factors have a more pronounced effect on intelligence test scores in developing countries than in industrialized ones. Now, one explanation of this is that in developed countries, the gap between the rich and the poor is not quite as profound as it is in developing countries. So the official poverty level in the United States is slightly more than $24,000 per family of 4 per year. This actually exceeds the average annual income of most other countries. So this just shows that when you have that profound gap, it's going to play a very large part in the socioeconomic factor and the intelligence test score correlation. And then finally, let's put it all together. Culture tests motivation. So a lot of times when we talk about gaps in intelligent test scores, it might not be determined by just one's intellectual skills, but it also might be determined by a person's motivation, their anxiety, and their attitude toward testing. So this leads us to what we call the low effort syndrome. And this is a low level of motivation on intelligence tests that are based on the belief that the tests are biased and that the test results are unimportant for success in life. So with this, our low effort syndrome, what happens is it's almost an example of a coping strategy. So no matter how hard I try, I'm going to be held back. So members of minority groups have been found that they may view positive feedback from a dominant group member more negatively than from a member of a dominant cultural group. And this plays on those coping strategies and that low effort syndrome. I hope you enjoyed the Chapter 5 lecture on intelligence. If you have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out to me.